Former Bilderberg Committee Chairman Etienne Davignon warned about the disintegration of the status quo and the emergence of new authorities and institutions. Out of the world's post-economic collapse phase of 2009, a new order was emerging. The Belgian aristocrat said, quote, "People understand confusedly that there is a change in the air. But no government will satisfy the reactions of the people. They have the greatest reticence and cynicism against anybody who holds responsibility. Against the business community because of the financial excesses. Also, the church has disappeared. The popular reaction is also a consequence of the fact that a number of traditional references have disappeared. People are looking for what is the reference." End quote. A new political cycle of a global era of digital presence. People no longer trusted the current institutions, yet failed to realize who controlled the new institutions that would replace the old. Victory through chaos. For those that know the name at all, Bilderberg projects power and secrecy, and there's no doubt that this group has a lot of power. Its members come from important sectors of politics and industry and business and finance and banking, and pretty much anywhere there's ever been the proverbial smoky room where decisions are made. They've been heavily involved in the creation of the European Union over 50 or 60 years, gradually bringing it to bear.
The barriers are going up between 6 European countries. Barriers up, tariffs down. That is the meaning of the common market, formed by France, Italy, Western Germany, with Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg.
They've created crises in oil and world politics and affairs. They had a lot to do with overseeing the fall of the Soviet Union. They were involved in stoking tensions in the Middle East and with the Israel-Palestine conflict. They've had their hand on the trigger for pretty much every major war. They've selected presidents and leaders, and more they're promoting a technocracy takeover of society through artificial intelligence and quantum computing. As far as secrecy, this is the first meeting in recent history where Bilderberg has not openly announced where it's going to be held and where the location has not successfully leaked out. No one yet knows where the 2019 meeting is happening.
Yeah, it's interesting because last year they announced it with more advance notice than probably ever. It was announced back in January that the meeting was going to be held in June in Turin, Italy. But I think that because certain people decided they weren't going to be reporting on it anymore, even people who had written books about it before talked about how it was no big deal anymore, and major players in what's supposed to be the independent alternative media decided to basically ignore it or give it very little coverage, if at all. The few independent reporters that did show up, people like Luke Rudowski and Dan Dix, they were breaking into people's hotel rooms in the middle of the night and shaking them down like as if they were terrorists. It was pretty intense for the people who actually were able to go to Italy last year and try to cover it.
It is day 2 here in Turin, Italy. We're covering the annual Bilderberg conference, and I was just detained by the police for a second time, rifling through my backpack, searching us, and they wanted to know where we were staying. But we were a little bit reluctant to show them the room number because some of the things we've heard, some guys busting in the doors, having guns in their faces, and that's exactly what happened to my friend Josh Friedman here, a journalist who's here covering Bilderberg.
The noise behind me is Italian police. About 10 minutes ago, maybe 5 minutes ago, they busted down my door, with guns pointed at me. They turned on the light. There was at least one gun pointed at me. A little nerve-wracking here in Turin in the early hours before Bilderberg 2018 gets underway.
It's very over the top, and it suggests that the group itself wanted them treated that way.
The major alternative players didn't have anything to really say much about it, and so I think they honestly didn't expect anyone to be there, which is really interesting since A, the location got leaked with so much advance notice, and B, last year was absolutely unprecedented in some of the people who showed up, the amount of governments that were represented, the fact that they were talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran, which we see the buildup of what's going on over there now and how relevant that is. And the fact that you had, for the first time in at least 20 years, the Bilderberg meeting happening on the same day as the G7 and a NATO defense ministers meeting, all happening all on the same exact day. I had looked at the time, and that had not happened like that in at least 20 years. So you might as well have had all of those people in the same room, basically. So last year's meeting, plus you had the Vatican represented. No one even knows if the Vatican, I'm sure maybe they've gone before, but no one knows that that's ever been the case. So that's just a lot of unprecedented things were happening at last year's meeting, and it really did signal a push towards war, which is really interesting since we see what's happening now with basically a push towards war in the Middle East. The anti-Iran rhetoric has been ratcheting up ever since pro-Israel Bush-era war hawk John Bolton took over as Trump's national security advisor. In 2015, he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times titled, "To Stop Iran's Bomb Iran." A unilateral, preemptive strike on Iran, just out of the box. Don't even declare war. He said the United States could do a thorough job of destruction, but Israel alone can do what's necessary. He came in on April 9th. That same day, Israel, in continuing its shadow war against Iran in Syria, did a pre-dawn airstrike that killed 4 Iranian military advisors. On May 8th, just a few weeks ago, Trump dumped the Iran deal. You had several sources in the White House being quoted by the Beacon. Team Bolton has spent years creating plans B, C, and D for dealing with the Iranian regime, and that President Trump hired him knowing that.
Yeah, I mean, I try to make a point to study the list every year, and there's definitely important people every year. But last year, in 2018, there were more prime ministers and deputies and assistants to prime ministers and presidents than pretty much any other time I've ever seen. And he had a lot of other senior officials as well, like defense ministers from Germany and the Secretary of Defense Office's net assessment guy from the U.S. You had prime ministers from Serbia and Estonia and Belgium and former prime ministers from France. And the list goes on and on. I'm not going to read all the individuals, but there were so many people there and the Secretary of State for the Vatican that you had to wonder, does this mean a war is starting? There's never any way to tell because they're stoking war all the time. And the Iran war, for instance, has been on the back burner, possibly the front burner. They've been kind of pushing it and getting it ready for years and years. And I've been fooled before into thinking that it was go time. I mean, you never know, but it really looks like they're pushing for it once again this year in 2019 with all the news items going on, with warships showing up, talk about deploying troops into the Middle East if Iran talks. John Bolton and other neoconish officials in the Trump administration really just pushing and pushing for war. You played that clip last year with Giuliani talking up how Bolton was definitely going to start a war by 2019 or in 2019.
You saw John Bolton. You remember John Bolton. He's going to be President Trump's national security advisor. You think he changed his mind? If anything, John Bolton has become more determined that there needs to be regime change in Iran. Regime change.
That's what John Bolton said. He said they were going to be celebrating regime change in Tehran by 2019.
That the declared policy of the United States of America should be the overthrow of the mullah's regime in Tehran. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. Thank you very much.
And here we are, and you can see everything that's happening. And so it's really weird that we're now in the middle of May And we haven't heard a peep out of the Bilderberg group as to where they're meeting this year or what their topics are going to be or who's going. And you almost have to wonder if the reason why is because A, it's going to become extremely obvious if we see that list and those topics. Even with as vague as they try to make those topics, if we see that list, it's going to be pretty obvious what's about to happen. And B, they just really did not, I don't think they expected anyone to show up last year since the bigger names didn't. Other than people like Luke and Dan Dix and a few other foreign independent people they didn't have anybody else, I don't think, really show up and talk about it. And I think they didn't expect people to. So the people who did show up and try to talk about it were terrorized and treated like terrorists. It was pretty awful. And so I think what they're trying to do this year, or at least it would appear, is to not give out that information at all or give it out very last minute, so that people will have less of a chance of making travel plans and being able to show up wherever it is that they're at.
It kind of gets understated sometimes how serious the group is. In 2016, it came out that they were discussing an internet ID at the Bilderberg conferences. All the social media elite who've gathered around the table and who've been building up the world that's become preeminent in our economy and our social lives and this whole online world. You know, these people are actually talking about cracking down on the people who are allowed to post online on what has now become known as deplatforming people. And this was back in 2016. Only 3 years later, we've seen really prominent cases of people getting banned from social media and banned pretty hard. At the same time, you've seen protesters of the Bilderberg group thin out completely. It's gone from crowds of 1,000 people down to 5 or 10.
Yeah, you can count it on two hands.
It was a very, very intense week, very stressful. I mean, the energy here is very dark. It's very gloomy. The police here and the military that they hired is just absolutely insane. It's reminiscent of what happened in Dresden with a very heavy-handed security protocol that was really just out of line. It was for basically 5 guys. like literally, there was 5 independent journalists out here and also Charlie Skelton.
And actually, what you have this year is the only website that's mentioned a location is an admitted parody website.
It's a joke.
It's a joke. They claim that Bilderberg is going to meet in Sierra City, California, and they've got 2 stories about it. And the stories, the way you read them and the way they're written, they claim they're a parody site and everything is for entertainment purposes, but the way they've written these is straight. It's a straight writing. So it is actually being done, I think, really probably so that they can just mislead people, so that people will tweet this out and send it out and make people think that's where it's going to be. I've
straight disinfo.
I've sent out a couple of tweets about this, and I've gotten the link to this article in response, which one of the articles straight up mentions Palo Alto in it. It almost seems like something that group would do, because the rest of the website is making jokes about conspiracy theorists and jokes about anti-vaxxers. And they have a pretty interesting political slant, and yet they write 2 very straight-sounding stories on Bilderberg supposedly being in this small town in California this year.
Where they also claim that Adolf Hitler was buried.
So, I mean, the site itself admits at the bottom that it's for entertainment purposes only. So, but people are sending this out, and they're saying that's where Bilderberg is going to be, and it's not. It's not going to be there, and I don't know. There's a lot of places in Europe I don't think they would go either. We're trying to almost guess now where we think it would be. It doesn't seem like it'd be in America either, since we seem to have some of the last few independent journalists here who actually are trying to cover it. I don't know. I'm not sure. Some people are saying Canada. That's the last I heard, is they think it might be Canada.
The speculation specifically of Mark Anderson from America Free Press, and he's been kind of picking up the torch after Jim Tucker passed away, but you can't replace the original, someone who was dedicated to the whole Bilderberg story. I think Mark does a good job, but he too is pointing out that it's just unprecedented that they haven't announced. And he's been talking with Tony Gosling, who's also been covering Bilderberg since forever ago. And he thinks it has to do with the Eurosceptic issue, the Eurozone, the return to national sovereignty, and kind of the far right leaders who are being elected. That may or may not be the case, but at any point they haven't announced. They just had the meeting in U.S. 2 years ago, so it'd be a little early, but they've had the past 3 U.S. meetings in Chantilly, Virginia at the same hotel, so you never know. But they only sometimes return to the same places in Europe and overseas and the other places that they hold them.
I think they really just don't want people to be able to make travel plans to show up, have to come there last minute. They're going to announce it last minute. And so now this lady, Lee Stewie, who's a contributor at Press for Truth, she reached out to the Bilderberg and asked when they would be releasing their location and attendees list this year. And she got back an email that said, "Thank you for your email and query. As ever, we will confirm details of this year's Bilderberg meeting in the run-up to the annual meeting," which is not as ever, because obviously they still haven't done it, and it usually happens anytime within the next 2 or 3 weeks, and that's unprecedented. "We will publish the location, agenda topics, and full list of participants a few days before." That's what they're saying now. They're only going to publish it a few days before it actually happens. "In the meantime, we kindly ask you for your patience and understanding. Best regards, Bilderberg Media Team." So they're saying they're only going to publish it a few days before, which could be, 2?
And yet people been coming to us and posting on Twitter saying they already announced it's going to be in Sierra City, California.
No.
Says an article where the guy claims he was invited to the meeting himself by Bill Gates personally. Yeah, so, but I think it's very significant to note, as we outlined in detail last year, and I think even the year before, there's been a very significant presence at Bilderberg of people whose business it is to deal with war, and a lot of the people who've been promoting the propaganda surrounding it. And now, this year, as we suggested last year, we see a direct push for war with Iran, which is pretty much the big one, and could easily spread into a World War III scenario. I'm not saying what's going to happen, but we have been looking at it.
They want to remap the Middle East. They've been trying to do that since before I was born. And last year, they specifically said Saudi Arabia and Iran. I think it's very interesting in the lead up to this year's Bilderberg meeting. You have what some people are saying may be a false flag, with Saudi Arabia claiming Iran attacked some ships. Right before that, Bolton had sent out preemptively ships just in case something goes down. I mean, the whole thing sounds like it's being set up. People are calling it the Persian Gulf of Tonkin already. So this is getting serious. And it's pretty obvious they were discussing this last year. And I think with what's actually going on right now, they don't really want people discussing it in terms of putting it into perspective with what happened last year and with what's going on right now with what it is they're talking about this year.
And I think the other half is they just don't want people to discuss it at all, because, everyone has seen what's been going on with online censorship and the rollback and the deplatforming of people. And it's probably outright dangerous to report on Bilderberg. But besides that, this is the group that's actually been talking about censoring people online. Again, you've got one of the Facebook co-founders on the steering committee. You have a key Google/Alphabet executive on the steering committee working with all these high finance individuals and banksters and politicians. And they've been talking about how do you control speech online, how do you implement online IDs, and so forth and so on, and working with the very social media companies and internet and computer companies that have built this entire ecosphere that is now raining down upon people and controlling what they say. So I think that's the other half of the giant story of what's happening. And the renewed secrecy of the Bilderberg group really kind of underscores that and kind of makes it eerie again, I think.
I think it's more relevant this year than ever. And I think that's probably why they're trying to be as quiet as possible. And when they release their information, saying they're only going to put out the full list of agenda topics and participants a few days before is not something they've done in the past. And you have to wonder why it is that it was released so early in advance last year, even though they quite obviously didn't expect anybody to really show up, as certain people decided to stop really covering it seriously anymore. And with those people, their fans and their followers stopped. The attention was not drawn to it anymore. And that's why they were discussing the post-truth world last year, because they know that that's something that the people in those meetings have helped create.
All the buzz terms around fake news and how to fight disinformation have come pretty much out of this group. Even the Munich Security Conference is here, and that's where Google presented its 2019 How to Fight Disinformation document, its white paper, which was one of the major planks in shutting down conspiratorial videos and history videos and medical and science information videos on YouTube, and deferring to, quote, authorities, deferring to mainstream media, and cutting out user content, especially where it leans political and especially if it's against their agenda and bias. this.
So the real question is then, why are they choosing to wait until the absolute last possible minute to announce their list and topics or even the location at all? Because last year they obviously showed they would step up response to the few handful of people who actually did bother to show up and treat them really, really over the top like terrorists. So if they're willing to go to that level, then why does it matter if they say where it's going to be or not? What are they so afraid of if they release this information? Because it really comes off as being afraid. It's really weird. I think that by saying they're not going to release the location, agenda topics, or full list of participants until a few days before, it's limiting the ability for people to put two and two together, match whatever's going on this year, no matter how vague they decide to make it sound, with what happened last year, showing the escalation in real time of what's happening geopolitically. I mean, I think it's going to become probably super obvious once they do release this list, what we're about to see, because it seems like there's some major shifts getting ready to happen on the horizon in the next year with 2020 coming. You have Agenda 21 UN goals coming with that. You've got a U.S. election happening with that. You've got a president who's made it clear since before he ever got elected his stance on going to war with Iran. I mean, he's pretty much been saying it since the campaign trail that he was just chomping at the bit to do that. So this is all coming together in just a fantastical, I mean, you can see the writing on the wall. It's almost as if they want to try to put the genie back in the bottle of what's known about them and keep themselves as secret as possible. I think that's why, and they probably won't release it till the last minute in the hopes that no one will come. I guess that makes this year more unprecedented than last year, which was already really crazy.
And therefore more interesting. Well, we'll find out as soon as we can, and then we'll know. Talk to you later, guys. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity during those years. But the world is much more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries. Reportedly, the remarks of David Rockefeller at the 1991 Bilderberg Group meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany.
Totally power tripping. He's power tripping. They're pointing that gun at everyone coming through.